You don't say. Challenge accepted. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for my 1/72nd scale M12 SPG. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, as I often mention in these videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. Because this model here is 172, it's outside of my normal working scale, but if anyone is interested in the scales that I do offer commission build services in, I can be reached via the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, I went ahead and scratch built some improvements to the model, and I also went ahead and 3D printed some other accessories. In this video, we're going to be giving this model a thorough in-box review. I'm going to go over several of the kit's features, as well as all the modifications and upgrades that were made to the build to bring it up to the condition that we have here. With that in mind, there's going to be a lot of really cool info coming right at you. So just sit back, relax, and enjoy the show. To kick this video off, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle here is the US M12 SPG. The M12 was a howitzer motor carriage that was developed by the US and was fielded throughout the entirety of World War II. The M12 was originally proposed in 1941, however it wasn't until 1942 when the unit was signed off ready for production, as well as also being fielded by the Army. The unit originally was actually canceled by the brass, however after further reevaluation it was deemed that this was a really good idea, and so they went ahead and pursued it. At the time, the U.S. heavy artillery was the M1918, which was a very high caliber ordnance, being 155 millimeter. However, as good as this weapon system was, it was just a standard towed artillery piece. So having the unit be mounted onto a fully mobile tracked platform was definitely something that was a really good idea, and it was also something that was cutting edge at the time, as the other countries around Europe, as well as on the Axis side, were doing the exact same type of thing. For the platform of choice, they went with the M3 Lee. Remember, this is 1941, and at the time, the M3 Lee was the standard U.S. medium tank of the period, with the Sherman in development that was going to come shortly after. So the M3 Lee was utilized as the main platform, and that's what the M12 was actually built on. The unit itself was going to utilize an all-riveted hull, combined with the power plant of the M3, which was of course the radial engine. But what was also interesting was the VVSS suspension used on the M12 was the heavy type of suspension that was found more commonplace on the Sherman. As I mentioned, the armament that the unit was going to be equipped with was the M1918 M1, which was a 155 millimeter howitzer, and it was the standard heavy artillery piece being used by the Army at the time. The unit itself is based on a French design that dates back to the World War I timeframe. The front portion of the vehicle was going to be for the automotive aspect, where the driver would have his controls. The engine would be mounted in the middle portion of the vehicle, which allowed the rear portion full access for the fighting compartment, which was necessary to equip the large ordnance. The ammunition was going to be a bit sparse, however this was solved by having another accompanying vehicle that was called the M30, which was basically the exact same vehicle as the M12, just sans the heavy artillery piece fitted on the back. These units would travel together and would keep the other units supplied. By far the most interesting aspect of the M12 design was the rear-mounted bulldozer blade. The purpose of this blade was that it would be deployed in the downward position, and this would scoop up the earth, which would help absorb the recoil, which was quite immense from this artillery piece. Because these vehicles were self-propelled, this was a huge advantage over their towed counterparts. They can go off-road with much more ease, are faster to deploy, and on top of that, they are more than capable of keeping up with the advance of the armor and the infantry. Although they entered into production in 1942, this is actually one of the more limited produced vehicles that were produced by the US during the World War II timeframe. Only 100 units in total were ever produced. However, they saw great service in World War II, and the units were quite popular. Eventually, the units were replaced by their successors, being the M40, which took the lessons from the M12 and basically improved upon it. And after the war, however, the unit was considered to be obsolete and was eventually retired. Unfortunately, almost all of the M12s that were produced were scrapped, with the exception of one lone survivor, which was preserved and is currently on display in Fort Sill, Oklahoma. And here's the model at the start of the project. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this Vintage ESCI 1/72nd scale M12 GMC. This model over here is a really fresh addition to the stash and the collection. I picked it up about a week ago, and it's been waiting to be filmed up until this point here, so there's not going to be any sort of shelf dust on it. Also, as one can clearly see, this is not a mint in box example. This is a bagged kit, and this was purchased in this format. As for where the model came from, I procured it off of eBay, again, about a week or so ago. This here was a definite impulse buy. This was not something I had pre-planned out. This was literally something that came to me when I was reading my comment section, as I always do. And one of my subscribers out there, and you know who you are, went ahead and mentioned in one of my 1/72nd scale build videos where he said that one of the hardest 172s that he built was the ESCI M12 GMC. To which I heard that and I said, okay, well, let me go ahead and find out exactly how hard this thing is. I've known about the M12 kit for eons now. I've known about most of the kits that are out there for quite some time, but the ESCI M12 kit was definitely one I had my eye on, but was just in my periphery, and like with many other kits that are out there, if anyone builds a lot of models, you'll know this. There are a lot of kits out there that are cool, but for one reason or another, you never really pulled the trigger on, and they're just kind of like floating around. Well, the M12 here, amongst many others, specifically from ESCI, are some of them. But I decided, you know what, perhaps now, this is time. Let me go ahead and crack one of these to see exactly what all the hoopla is. The ESCI kit itself, of course, is a vintage model kit. ESCI is an Italian-based, or I should say was an Italian-based model company that were working out of Italy in the 1970s timeframe, throughout the 80s, and eventually went bust in the early or mid portion of the 1990s. Since then, a large number of their kits have been acquired by Italeri and have been re-released periodically under the Italeri brand. As for this kit over here, I'm not sure if this is one of the ones that did that, but obviously by the time I'm editing this, I'll definitely be able to tell you yay or nay. Either way, the ESCI M12 kit is a very interesting release because the M12 itself is a very interesting variant or slant on the M3 Lee pattern. Yes, the M12 is not really based on the Sherman, it's actually based more on the M3. But I probably already mentioned more about that history in the previous scene that came before this one here. As for this one, the kits were tooled up by ESCI in the mid-1970s, and this kit here, it says on the internet, 1975 was when the original tooling came out. ESCI would continue to produce this kit up until eventually them going under. ESCI created a wide range of specifically military vehicle kits in scales between 172 and also 135, several of which I've already done reviews on and can be found on the channel. Their 1/72nd scale kits, specifically their World War II kits, were tooled up in the 1970s timeframe. Then in the 1980s, they would move on to produce kits from the modern era, and that's when we would see things like the M1 Abrams, the M163, the Merkava, and several others to name a few. But for this one over here, this was part of their original lineup and has some, shall we say, features on here that would eventually change on the subsequent kits that came out later on. And if anyone knows a thing or two about my videos, you'll probably know what I'm going to be mentioning. One thing about the ESCI kits is that even though the tooling on them is quite old and dated specifically for today, when the kits were originally tooled up back in the day, they were actually quite highly regarded. ESCI kits had the stigma of being very high quality, and this is something that I've even personally seen on several of the builds that I've done from them. Their kits are very, very detailed for what they are, and specifically for the time frame we're talking about here, they were on the upper end of quality compared to some of the other contemporaries. For instance, in 1/35th scale, you had the old school Tamiya M60A1, and admittedly, the ESCI one was definitely superior to that kit in terms of detailing. Not so much in terms of track assembly, but definitely in detailing wise, the ESCI kit was definitely better than the original Tamiya M60A1. So that's basically what we expect here. As for this one, well, normally this time I would go ahead and give the model a thorough in-box review, but obviously that's not going to be the case for this one. This one has the Ghetto exclusive Ziploc bag, so let's just go ahead and dive right into it. The kit itself is an all injection molded plastic model kit. There are no modern amenities such as photo etch or turned aluminum or anything like that. I'm also unaware if there are any other hop-ups on the market for this particular kit specifically. If there is, I'm pretty sure someone out there can put that in the comment section, or I might even add that as an addendum later on as the video wraps up. But as I'm filming this right now, I'm unaware of any sort of aftermarket kits out here. The kit itself is all made out of this tan injection molded polystyrene plastic, and this is the same plastic seen on the other ESCI kits from the same period. The kits come sealed in their original bag like this one here, and although the box is missing, this bag here is original, and this is how the kits would be seen when you dump out the contents from the side opening tab. As for the box art, I might as well go ahead and throw it on screen right now. This is what the box art for this kit would have looked like originally, and as the subsequent releases came out, they altered the box slightly, but the box art essentially stayed the same. It's also interesting to point out that as for M12s, I believe there's another version of the same vehicle from Hasegawa, but as it turns out, I think the tooling is actually the ESCI one, and it was just a simple rebox by Hasegawa, or that's apparently what the scuttlebutt on the internet is claiming. Haven't built the Hasegawa one personally, so I can't really say for certain. I will also say that this kit was definitely ahead of its time because this was the only option out there for for just the M12 in general. The M12 was one of those vehicles that was ignored and bypassed for many, many, many years, and it wasn't until 1999 or so was when a brand new tooling kit of an M12 would emerge from Academy, and that was in 1/35th scale. I actually have one of those kits. I built it many years ago. It's going to be a contender for a OTR video, but either way, that's something down the road. Either way, for the longest time, this kit here was the de facto kit for an M12, and being in 172. Some people wish it was in 135, but 172 it was if you wanted an M12. So, opening up the bag, which appears it already did on its own, this model definitely wants to be built. It doesn't want to be kept in this format over here, and I don't blame it. It no longer has its box, and without the box, it really wants to be built. So, let's go ahead and dump out the contents. So, here we go. The first thing I am going to start with are the tracks, and this is something that if anyone's seen my other ESCI builds is going to look very different. You see, ESCI was one of the first companies, or if not, it was the first company to give us the cancerous, garbage, individual link and link tracks, which as we know I can't stand. However, at one point in time before they lost their way, they actually had a brainstem and they gave your tank kits single piece vinyl tracks. And this kit here being a kit from the 70s, and all the kits apparently from the 70s had this pattern of track. So if we go ahead and start with this, the track is made out of this silver vinyl color, which is quite typically seen on many tank kits, specifically from this era. Airfix would do this, Italeri would do this, and as for the quality tracks themselves, they feel very Italeri-ish. If anyone catches my drift, the type of tooling that we see here and the material seems like the type of thing would be given to us from Italeri. Anyway, here goes the tracks themselves. These tracks, by the way, I believe are also recycled on another couple of Sherman kits that they did produce. They produced a 1/72nd scale M4A1 and also another slant on the M4A1 with the Screaming Mimi. But either way, here go the tracks that we have here. The track detailing is very nicely done. We have the track teeth, we have the rubber pad sections integrally molded on. This is a huge leg up compared to the kits that came out in years after this, where they went to individual link and length, where the tracks had no teeth or inner detailing on them whatsoever. So much for the individual links look more realistic. Yeah, no they don't. It's a cost-cutting measure, and you can't convince me otherwise. Specifically since I know tooling. Anyway, on this side over here, we have the track pads themselves. This track is replicating the rubber chevron pattern of the Sherman track, and the track is very nicely rendered out. You can see the track pads right there invisible, as well as the teeth sections, also very nicely rendered out, specifically for the scale and the era that we're talking about here. This is the mid-1970s. To put things in perspective, Tamiya was doing their kits still motorized at this time, and the detailing on them was basically fudged in a way to make the vehicles more suitable for motorizational use. So that's basically the period that we're talking about. This kit definitely was going to be punching well above its own weight. Okay, with that out of the way, this takes us to the decal sheet. The decal sheet supplies with a bunch of markings, and this was something that was either a hit or miss I found on a lot of the ESCI builds I've done in the past, where it seems like for some reason the quality on these decals weren't really the best in terms of aging, where when they were new they probably worked pretty well. However, from my personal experience, it's been hit and miss on these markings, where it comes time to install them, you put them in the water, and a lot of times the paper gets wet, but the decal just Thanos snaps and disintegrates into oblivion. I have had examples though where they worked, but it's basically a coin toss if whether or not they survive. On this one here, that remains to be seen. But here go the decal sheets, simple water slide decals. They look a bit yellow. Again, probably from the age. This kit is over 40 plus years old. Maybe it's close to 50 at this point, depending when it was actually produced. But needless to say, it's not exactly a spring chicken. So there go to decals. We'll see how this pans out as the build goes on. Okay, the first runner is this one right over here, and this contains the majority of the hull components as well as the suspension. So start with the hull. The hull is a multi-piece assembly, which is something we've seen on several other builds from the same era. For instance, the Airfix Sherman was a similar type of assembly. And we'll start with the side sections that we have right here. You can see it has the final drive integrally molded on. It does have some basic detailing on the geometry, but it is missing the small little fasteners that are used to secure the piece in place. We also have the back sections here of the bogie housings. They do have the fastener details present, and we do have a very simplistic looking rear idler mount. We also have some knockout marks in these sections over here, and this is something I am going to have to contend with, but that's the area that we're talking about here. We also have here the lower plate. Note it has the original ESCI logo right there. This is something that would change on their later production kits, but this older school one here has this type of a layout. We have here some basic suspension sections. We have the roll wheels, which are separately molded from the bogie housings themselves. It's actually a nice feature, and it's something that we see on several other kits. Most of the time you see these on kits larger in scale, but in 172 it's actually a nice bit of detailing. We have the sprockets right over there, as well as the rear idler wheels. Flipping over the detailing, you get to see what the details look like on the opposite side. These wheels are replicating the stamped road wheel type setup, which is of course more than appropriate for this vehicle. And you can see the sprockets here. This one appears to have a little gap in that section. That's something I'm going to have to contend with, but other than that, it's definitely doable. The idlers have their idler caps present with the fasteners, and they look pretty good. Here we have the bogie housings themselves with the VVSS. They are single molding, which makes them easy to assemble. I'm not seeing the spring detailing present, so yeah, there's no inner spring details that are found on these tooling sections over here. It's just the basic swing arms and the housings itself. The return roller appears to be integrally molded on, which is something that cuts down on part count and makes the build just go by a little bit easier. They are a two-part assembly, so you will have some seam work to contend with, and I'll be circling back to that as the build continues. On this section here, you get to see the bottom section of the hull. We have here the rear section with the large square axis panels right over there. They have their fastener details and their axis panel detailing as well. We also have the rear spade, which of course being an SPG, you need to have that thing get anchor itself into the ground, and on the M12 is done with this giant spade section, much like an M40. Spade itself is nicely detailed, like the teeth section over here. It's going to weather nicely, and the geometry does look very good. And we have other sections of detailing. These are the side sections, I assume, for the spade itself, and we'll see what that looks like as the build continues. We have other sections, such as some diamond plate areas that go on top of the spade for the crew fighting compartment area. The diamond plate is nicely rendered out. Again, in 1/72nd scale, that's a nice touch. And it's nice and crisply molded. We have some basic crew figures. It's not really relevant to me. I never put crew on my vehicle, so these guys are just going to spend eternity in the spare figure bin. And by the way, I'll just come out and say, as I generally do, I literally have like thousands of tank commanders and figures like this, if any, in multitude of scales, and if anybody wants them, hit me up. I could definitely make some space. You can reach me via the email address listed below, info@eastcoastarmory.com. So with that little quick plug out of the way, you can see here the headlights. They have their headlights with the brush guards integrally molded on. Back sections are pretty simple, but again, should be suffice for the job at hand, specifically in this scale. And we also have the rear mud flaps right over there, nicely rendered out. And I don't see any issues here, and this build should go by fairly easily, from what I can tell. Okay, the next runner contains the other components, such as the upper hull sections. So right off the bat, we have the upper hull right here. The detailing is excellent. It has the nice engine grill sections right over there found on the midsection of the vehicle, and we also have the vehicle with open hatches. And this is something that's a little bit different compared to the other ESCI kits that came out afterwards in 172, where generally those builds had the hatches integrally molded to the turret and or hull. On this one here, they actually had them rendered in an open position. If memory serves, I believe their M4A1 Sherman even has full interior detailing. So that is something that's a bit ahead of its time. We have here the three-piece transmission cover. Again, it's very appropriate for an M12. We have the flange sections. They have their integral rivets molded on. They look fantastic. And the remainder of the sprues consists of the hatches with the Little grab handles. The visors have a middle section that's open, gives for better detailing, although on the real one there would be a periscope on the inside. I may go ahead and add a little piece of clear plastic just for a little bit of accuracy, but we'll see how that goes on. And we have here the long tom. So here's the long tom section. It is a two-piece assembly, so of course seam work will be required. And we also have a bunch of other accoutrements for the long tom, such as the recuperators and all sorts of other little gizmos. Tow cable right over here. We have the side hatch for the driver right there. The periscope is nicely rendered out. We have the hinge section, which I think would be for the spade in the back. And we have the other sections of the side armor plate, which will have their rivets integrally molded on. Again, nicely detailed. On the reverse side, you get to see the bottom base here for the howitzer, how it mounts to the vehicle, as well as the main carriage itself. Again, everything here looks like it's going to be a nice build. I like the way the detailing is integrally molded on, and everything is nice and crisp. And again, this is something that we've seen on the other ESCI kits that I've brought to table in the past. The vehicle also has separate molded tools. As I can see here, we have a we have a sledgehammer, as well as the cleaning staves. Of course, this being an HMG, you will definitely need to swab the barrel, and the cleaning staves will definitely do that. We have an axe, we have some fire extinguishers, travel lock, crank wheels, and a pulley in the back, and this is actually where the cable for the spade goes ahead and wraps up. Really cool kit, and that's all there is to it. So let's go ahead and quickly go into the instructions. So the instructions are right over here. This is the original box art that the vehicle had. Like I mentioned before, they kept on recycling this box art in a couple different formats as production continued. But this is, by the way, is kit number 8029 for those who are interested. 1/72 scale, of course, and cracking it open, you will see old school modeling instructions at its finest. So here we have a cool photograph of the real M12s in action during World War II. Here goes a nice part layout, so you can see where the components are and how they should rest on the sprues. Even though they don't have the numbers on them, which usually when they do this, it's because they need to tell you the numbers, but for some reason they didn't do that. And as for the instructions themselves, they are old school drafted drawings. So old school is old school can get, and most people say old school is best school. Pretty self-explanatory kit in that manner, and looks like it should be a fun little build. You do have an option here for a camouflage pattern. I'm probably not going to roll with that. I'm just going to roll with classic OD, but we'll see how that pans out as the build continues. Jumping forward a little bit, here we have the model ready for painting, and in my usual format, I kind of added some extra goodies to the build in order to spice it up to improve it from the kit original offering. As well as I also went ahead and added some new detailed parts that, well, I'll get to in a moment. So, straight off the bat, the main armament here is not yet glued in place. Neither is the travel lock. This is something that's going to be added after everything is thoroughly painted. And of course, the reason why this is done is just so I can get into these areas over here to get things primed and painted, let alone weathered, so there aren't any missed spots, which you would undoubtedly get if the thing was fitted in place. So I'm going to quickly go ahead and pop this guy off. As for the construction on this guy over here, it was actually pretty easy and straightforward. There wasn't any surprises per se. The only kind of surprise I did run into was when I installed the piece in place, the crank handle over here, the stem emerged slightly too much and was interfering with the sidewall, so I just simply polished it down with some sandpaper, and then once the clearances were addressed, the piece then fits absolutely perfectly. The other thing to mention is the armor shield over here. There's no real clear indication point of where it goes precisely, so you kind of have to just fiddle with it until finally get it into the appropriate area, and once it's in place, it's good to go. To actually help me with this one, I used my 1/35 scale Academy M12 build that I did eons ago. It's in really bad shape. More likely it's going to be the subject matter of its own OTR video, but that remains to be seen. Either way, that went together pretty well. The assembly on this guy, it's a 2/2 assembly, so seam work was dealt with, and then once the seam work was eradicated, I went ahead and shot it with a flat black primer just to make sure everything has been polished away, which, as you can see, it has been. For modifications, I went ahead and added just a small little fret here of 3D print for the handle. I also went ahead and added 2 little sewing pins over here to replicate the fasteners for the recuperators that are found on the back section. This is totally naked on this kit over here, so the addition of those details will help once it's all painted and weathered. That's really all there is to the main armament itself. Travel lock, nothing much to go over there, so I'll just set this guy aside. Okay, so the hull. Where to begin? I guess good spot, if there was any, was the front. Here you get to see the bow transmission area. Added some of the Tamiya texture paint to the front section to replicate the cast texturing, which would be found on the real unit, and it simply brushes on. I brush it onto the front as well as the side sections just to get some kind of texturing on the side locations. This here area here, I had a little seam, so I add a little swipe here of red putty, blended that in with the cast texturing, and it's good to go. On the top sections, I went ahead and fabricated the very thin little supports sections, which are present on all Sherman pattern vehicles. This is just made out of thin soda can aluminum, cut to shape, carefully bent and fitted to place. And once that is dry, it's going to look, or I should say once it's painted weathered, it's definitely going to shine. On the top portions of the tin work, I actually added the seam lines found in these two sections here. On the kit, the tin work is just continuous, and on the real one, of course, these mud flaps here would be two separate parts. So I went ahead and just scribed the line in there very carefully with an X-Acto, giving it for the seam line that would be present on the real unit. Panel line accents is definitely going to make that shine. But this is a very tricky technique because you could easily go off, and if that happens, your life is now more difficult. But if you have a nice steady hand and a straight edge, you should be able to scribe the lines in like I did over here and have some good results with it. The other details that I added were the arms found on the brush guards. Thin soda can aluminum came in handy, and boy was that a pain with this small scale, but I was still able to persevere. And even though it's small scale, that did not stop me from going ahead and adding little jars found on each side for the plunger, which, as we all know, on Sherman pattern vehicles, there would be a little chain retained plunger in that section over there that would plug up the area for the headlight when not in use. Chain, I'm not going to replicate in 172, but at least the little canister is there. That's made from a little spare sprue running around from a 3D printed project that I did a little while ago. We also have here the siren right over there, dead center. That's all stock with the molding, and that went on without any issues. On the side portion, you get to see the addition of a small little grab handle that is absent on the kit. It will be found on the real one, so with a pin vise, I drilled out two little holes, and I carefully bent some floor wire into place, and there we have it. Hatches went on without any sort of problems, and that's really all there is to this area over here. So this takes us now to the back section, and this is obviously where the majority of the work really was done. So at first glance, you'll see that I went ahead and added some flat black paint to all these sections over here. It's just flat black Tamiya, and the reason why I added it before the unit was assembled was, again, trying to get access into these areas over here with the paint. Not very easily done, so to hedge my bets, I went ahead and just took care of that with a paintbrush so that there's paint on those surfaces, and when the subsequent layers go on afterwards, at least I'll have something there and you will not have bare plastic. On the inner portions, you get to see where the air filters are present. Again, these were taken care of. And everything assembles out of the box. This section here goes together pretty well, as does this area. However, here we did have a slight little seam in this area once everything was assembled, and that is just a small little piece of Plastruct styrene that I just wedged into this section over here, snipped it, and then blended it in, and that's really all there is to it. And it does a good job with plugging up the seam and making everything look a bit more proper. And this gets us to the rear section. The rear section goes together pretty well, although there aren't really any lock points for certain accessories, so you kind of have to fudge things here and there in order to get the piece to fit on in place. That was namely true, I think, for the rear tin work over here. Trying to get the piece to fit with the spade section is probably one of the more trickier aspects on the kit. Some hand fitting is going to be required across the board on this section, but it's far from anything that's overly egregious or impossible, and I was able to navigate the borders pretty well, and I think I was able to get a good balance on where things go and how everything fits together. On the spade itself, this actually was, again, a bit tricky with the way it goes together. It is a multi-piece assembly, and the instructions does have it laid out pretty well. Let me see, right here. However, when it comes time for actually fitting the pieces together, it doesn't really lock all that well, nor are there really any good suggestion points. So you're kind of more or less winging it, and you're just fudging the thing together until finally it gets the appropriate shape. again, I was able to pull it off, but it was something that could have been, it will definitely be something that will give a more novice builder a little bit of a curveball, but it was still easily done by the end of the day. The other thing to mention is the functionality. So the piece does have some functionality that's intended to be used with it. However, because of the small scale of all these little parts, they're a bit fiddly, and they seem to break really easily. And then on top of that, trying to make the thing function in 172 is a fool's errand, because on the real one, it's all done with pulleys and rigging, and you can't really do that and have it work in this small scale. So on this one here, I'm going to go ahead. I just love sending me texts. You're going to have to pick one, either the piece being in the deployed state or in the retracted state. And on this one here, I'm going with the piece in its transport mode, which means the blade is going to be up and the main armament is going to be travel locked in place. So that is something that you kind of have to pick when you're rolling with a kit like this. And this is actually no different with the 135th scale counterpart. The Academy one is the same thing, and I could also say the same thing about the M40 for that matter. With these type of pulley type draw systems, you're either going to keep it open or keep it closed, and there's no functionality to it in that regard. So once I decide I'm going to make the thing in this position over here, I went ahead and glued everything solid. And I also went ahead and had the little lock arms clip into their appropriate locations. This is where, again, you have some fudging because the piece isn't exactly lining up where they need to go. So you are going to have to fudge things here and there, and again, in order to get the piece to act accordingly. And I was able to pull that off. So since the piece was glued and locked, I might as well go ahead and add and fabricate the remainder of the pulley details, and that was what we have over here. So the way on the M12, the way the system works is we have a reel in this area, and this holds the cable that keeps the entire thing either deployed or retracted. And so you can see how the cable actually runs. And we have the cable. It comes from this section here. By the way, the cable's all made out of thin floor wire, so very easily to manipulate and get into the appropriate areas. So we have here the cable. It runs from the spool through this little guide into this double pulley here, and the pulleys I have to fabricate out of just some sprue of 3D print that I had floating around, as well as also some styrene strip, and you'll see that in a second. But you can see the double pulleys here that takes the pulley from this section and it actually lowers it and then has it come out from the bottom area into what would be this pulley, which would then rotate it to go across the bulldozer blade or the spade. Then it would have it go this way into this pulley found on the reverse side. Then it would emerge from the bottom portion, and that's where it would be mounted on the real one, a small little hook found on the rear portion of the spade. And that's how the piece is able to be elevated evenly by just one little spool on the opposite side. That's how they're able to pull it off, just with all this pulley work that you see here. So obviously this is going to look really good once it's painted and weathered, and it's going to be a real focal point on the build. And if I was to make the piece function, you have to omit all of that, and that really just kneecaps the build. It removes a lot of detailing from this area here. And again, this is no different than, say, the M40. And that's what we have going here on the rear. And this takes us to some other details that I fabricated for the side. So on the side portion here of the M12, I went ahead and added these little sewing pins in a row. And on the real unit, there would be these fasteners found in this area because that's what separates the fighting compartment from the automotive aspect. On the real vehicle, the automotive aspect is right here in the middle of the vehicle, and there is an exhaust manifold that emerges from these sections that run along these two intersections here and emerge from the outer portions of the hull. So we do have some fasteners found in these areas, and they were added again with just a pin vise with some sewing pins. And then it comes for the addition of the exhaust manifold tips. And this is where the kit is lacking, in that there are no provisions for this detailing whatsoever with the kit. So I'm like, it's time to roll up my sleeves and hit up CAD. I went ahead and with photographs of the real surviving M12 that was at Aberdeen, now that's been restored into a museum somewhere. There were some pretty good photographs of this section. I was able to go ahead and bring it into the piece that we have here, and this here is resin 3D printed. These ones here are printed by another vendor that I'm using from time to time for certain prints. However, this piece I decided to go ahead and offer to the community. post-production John quickly chiming in here. When the parts were designed and when I went ahead and filmed the scene here, the original idea was to post these components on the ECA Shapeways store. However, since the time I filmed this video and the time I'm editing the video, the Shapeways store and the whole marketplace as a whole is no longer in existence. Instead, the parts are now going to be posted on the ECA small scale parts catalog page, and the direct link can be found below, as well as also below in the video description. With that out of the way, let's continue with the video. Here we have something new, the new ECA 1/72nd scale M12 exhaust manifold kit, where you get enough pieces to assemble not one, but at least two of these M12 kits from ESCI. The pieces are a direct drop-in installation. They have all of their detailing present, which would include the mounting plate that has some fasteners on it. The fasteners are at the right number that are found on the real one, and the pieces also have the right geometry with the triangular shape, and hopefully it comes out on focus, but you can see the tip is printed hollow, and we have the deflector right over there. It's like a little piece of sheet metal like this, and it keeps the exhaust manifold smoke from going straight out and goes into a downward motion, and that has been incorporated onto the prints. Again, lifted directly off the real one. The two things that you do not see fitted yet on this model are, of course, the suspension. This is painted off the model in order to get the inner sections and the reverse areas of the housings thoroughly painted. So this is something that's going to be done first, and then they're going to be fitted when the time comes. But another fitting that is not yet added, and it's why I had it on the table, is this little strip here of plastic. Why we have this strip of plastic is because one little area that, again, it's missing on the ESCI, it's also missing on the Academy example for reasons that are a mystery to me, is with this little triangle that we have right here. This is a distinctive bit of detailing found on the M12, and this is one of those things I'm like, well, that's really cool that's here, but what does it actually do? Well, if you're wondering, this piece here is actually a guard. More than likely, it's used to protect the exhaust manifold from any sort of crap that comes up from the sprockets or the tracks, and there is actually a guard that emerges from the lower hull and actually connects to this little piece here of the triangle. It's a little piece of steel that goes from here to here and connects in that area. And that is what I have this little piece of plastic for. When the time comes, I'm going to go ahead, it's going to be painted and weathered with the vehicle, then I'm going to cut it to shape and glue it into this section right there. And you'll see this at the tailor, or at the next following scene when the thing's already built and completed. And the reason why it's not fitted at this time is because I need to first fit on the track in order to install that guard. So once the track is installed, then I can install the guard, and then you'll see what it looks like in its completed state. But the reason that the ESCI and later the Academy don't have that is a bit of a mystery, and it's definitely something that it should have. Matter of fact, if you have either of those kits, I recommend going ahead and adding that little piece extra. Easy to fabricate, just a little piece of styrene strip, and you're good to go. Jumping forward a little bit takes us to the running gear. At this point here, the model's actually going through its painting process, as is the suspension. Prior to the units being assembled, all of the suspension components were pre-primed and painted for the reasons that I mentioned in the previous scene. This is a huge departure compared to which is normally convention. What most modelers out there tend to do, they build the whole thing and then try to paint. And on a Sherman, I can tell you from personal experience, that is definitely the worst way to do so because of the nature of these things here. You're going to have areas of missed paint. This, by the way, is the universal truth for all Shermans in any scale, be it from 172 all the way up to 1.6, and even the real one. That's why if you notice when you see real ones getting restored, they tend to take the suspension apart to thoroughly paint them. For the same reasons. And if you're a fan of the channel, you'll know that this is the technique that I advocate for every single tank, be it, again, small scale, large scale, T55, M60, whatever. Generally, it's best to go ahead and pre-paint the suspension prior to assembly and then installation. And for these ones over here, they're going through that process. So here you can see one of the trucks right here. The wheels have been assembled. The wheels can still rotate, which is going to be helpful when trying to paint the rubber tires, but that's going to be done after all the weathering work is completed. The suspension set on the ESCI is very similar to many other Shermans on the market, be it in 135 and smaller, where the bogie housing is a two-part assembly. The wheels are separate, so they can still spin, like I just referenced. And normally on many other Sherman kits out there, the return roller and the spring system are separate molded pieces that you have to fit in place. However, on the ESCI, it's all integrally molded, so it does streamline things quite a bit. However, one byproduct that you will have is a center seam where the two halves meet, and again, this is quite customarily seen on many other Shermans on the market. On this one over here, to remedy this, I took a little swipe of thick super glue and I added it to the areas where the seams are present. Then I polished them down with a needle file. This does make short work of it, and once it's all polished away, it makes for a better build. Arguably, you don't have to necessarily do it specifically in 1/72nd scale, as most of the sections I just mentioned are covered up with the track. However, on the return roller right over here, and also on the front portion here of the bogie housing and even the skid rail, that is something that is present, and the seam is noticeable. Albeit it's very small, but it's something you can still notice nonetheless. But with the amount of work it takes to just add a little swipe of material on this section and that section, you might as well just do the whole thing, which is what I did. The other thing that I did was with a pin vise with a really tiny pin or drill bit, I went ahead and drilled out the 4 fastener locations holes found on the face. As I often mention in Sherman pattern videos, the Sherman bogie housing was a casting that was used on either side, and to do this, both sides of the flat sections were drilled and tapped so that you could bolt on the equipment for the return roller as well as the skid rail. And if you're, depending on which side the piece is mounted on, you would have a side exposed with the holes that are tapped. So on this model over here, I went and did this as I do on my other Sherman builds, because again, it's a great way to add a little bit of extra accuracy out of the model. And it's one of those procedures where if you have the equipment and you have the skill sets, it definitely doesn't take that much extra time to go ahead and add those, and it's one of those things that helps the build in the long run. As for the bit itself, I actually have this set up right here on my pin vise, and the bit, like I said, is ridiculously tiny. Let me see if I can get it in focus. It is a number, what is that, 70, is a number 76 drill bit, and it is 0.50 millimeters. So there you have it, 0.50 millimeters. And as for the bits themselves, quick shameless plug, I go ahead and purchase my bits from the vendor listed in the video description below. With all of the wheel suspension housings assembled at this point here, I could go in and progress further into paint. But before I do, for good measure, I'm going to go ahead and take a swipe of Tamiya flat black paint on the paintbrush, add it to these areas where I had to do the body work, just so it'll make the addition of the airbrush base coat adhere a bit more easily. And we'll take less coats as opposed to just trying to build up layers raw. Also, here we have these sprockets. They went together without any sort of problems. The one thing about sprockets you want to pay attention to is with the gates where they connect to the sprue. You want to be careful when removing them so that you don't accidentally over remove material, which can destroy the look of the sprocket. So it's a little delicate balancing act, but if you're careful with your X-Acto game, you should be able to navigate the waters pretty well. In addition to this, the X-Acto, I think I also use a needle file and or some sandpaper carefully just to point the edges on the teeth, just so that it blends in with the remainder of the sprocket work. The sprockets themselves line up pretty well, and should also time quite well with the track itself, but that's something that remains to be seen, and I'm going to find out one way or another when the thing goes into final assembly. With the model fully completed, you get to see the VVSS suspension now fully completed and fitted to the vehicle. The road wheels have all been painted, and as I mentioned before, it's a good thing that I did not glue the wheels static to the suspension housings, because it does alleviate the painting work and makes it go by a bit easier. Painting the faces is one thing that's relatively easy to do, where the real trick comes in when on these 172 Shermans is painting the rims and doing so on each side. That is what really separates the bold from the cowardice, shall we say. If you have a very tight paintbrush and a very good steady hand, you should be able to pull it off. Because the wheels can't pivot, well, this makes it a little bit easier because it acts like a lathe, and you can spin the wheel carefully while the brush is applying the paint. Again, your paint game really needs to be on point. But if you navigate the waters correctly and the planets line up, you should have some pretty good results. As I mentioned before, one aspect that makes the M12 a bit different from your standard garden variety VVSS Sherman is that most Shermans you can install the suspension after you pre-apply the paint onto the bogie housings. However, for this one here, the suspension was mounted more like on a German tank or on a modern tank, where it's at the very tail end of the build, just before the installation of the tracks. Or at least that's how I do it. Some people like to glue them all static, and those people are crazy. Anyway, back to this one over here. So the reason why the suspension, it's not glued on before the tracks get fitted, is because of that hook and spike that we have right here. Because of this little fellow, the track needs to be slipped on first, and then you could just pop on the 3 bogie housings. So that's purely an M12 thing. Falls on a standard Sherman, it's not really necessarily something you need to worry all that much about. Although I will say, though, for a smaller scale Sherman like this one over here, perhaps that's a good idea because, in retrospect, trying to muscle the track around the skid rail and also around the return roller is something that can potentially be a little bit troublesome or just a little bit difficult. And if you slap, or I should say slip the track on first and then pop the bogie housings underneath, that potentially alleviates that issue. So, take that for what you will. Of course, this being a VVSS Sherman, the return rollers are painted with a swipe of silver paint. These components are not rubber rimmed on a VVSS Sherman. This is a big area where a lot of people tend to make this mistake on their builds. A lot of people over there, they get it confused with the HVSS, which is rubber rimmed, but the VVSS, that was never the case. These return rollers here were always steel, and so the track would polish them up quite quickly in use. So that's why a little swipe of silver paint is what's always utilized on them. On the same token, the rear idler wheel is just like with the return rollers. It is always steel on these VVSS equipped Shermans. So paint them accordingly. Some people out there, even some of the larger YouTube modeling channels, they tend to represent this with a swipe of black paint for one reason or another. Again, not a good idea. When you're building these, also, a lot of people may just want to leave it with the base color of olive drab. This too, it's better than the black, I'll give you that. But the one problem is that after the vehicle's driven for not that long of a distance, these tracks will just polish down these surfaces on these components, so the paint wouldn't last long at all. And unless you're essentially rendering the model as a gate guard, that's something that really wouldn't be seen in real life, specifically on a vehicle that's in operation or has been used. In addition to the return roller, the skid rails were also swiped with a little bit of silver paint. For again, the same reason, it always gets polished down. And on this one over here, it was actually easier to do that because, again, the VVSS were installed after the track. On the rear idler wheel, on one of these sides, I believe it was on this side over here, I had a mishap during the build, and I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the axles broke off. I forgot if it broke off from a accident, like I dropped it or something, or if the piece just was mismolded, but I think it was definitely probably the former than the latter. But anyway, I had to go ahead and replicate the axle, and this is an important one because this has to take load. You can't just, if you have a model, regardless of the tank type, and you bust an axle either for the sprocket or the idler, you can't just rely on glues alone to hold it in place. It's a common thing people might think of on the spot. Oh, it's broken, let me just glue it on. Problem is, the second this thing is under tension, it's going to bust right out. And I've seen it happen all too many times, some of my older, very older archaic builds. I know about all these areas because I made these mistakes myself, guys. Anyway, and these things take the brunt of the tension on the track, specifically single-piece vinyl. And in order to thwart that, you have to have an actual axle. So for this one over here, I used a pin vise. I drilled out the axle stub that was remaining, and I replaced it with a steel shaft, or a steel rod. I believe it was a 16 of an inch piece of floor wire, and once that piece was solidified in place, really sturdy, really robust, and as you can see, it held up to the tension of the idler absolutely perfectly. Also on this location over here, you get to see the exhaust manifold. Hopefully it comes out in focus. There you go. With the camera readjusted, that should definitely do the trick. So the detailing here really gives the model a really nice punch above its weight. The manifold is such an important bit of detailing, and it's so unique on an M12 that it's the only tank that I know of, specifically with the US, that it juts out from the side of the hull. The only thing that comes to me really quick, it would be probably the Elephant, but the exhausts are on the sponsons. Sticking out of the side hull like this, there's not really a whole lot of vehicles that actually do that. M12 is definitely unique in that regard. Anyway, the 3D printed resin part was painted, weathered, and as you can see, again, it just really completes the look of the model nicely. As do the fasteners I was referencing before. Now they're all blended in with the paint and weathering work. They stand out. Oh, and here you get to see that little guard that I was also referencing before as well. This needed to be added after the track was added for the same reasons that I mentioned previously, but now that they're fit in place, yeah, it really does a number on the model. And of course, it is a mirror image on the reverse side. Move our way to the front, brings us to the sprockets. These are the kit supplied units. And as you can see, went on without any sort of issues. And I add that little hole, which would be found on the center portion of the Sherman sprocket hubs. I believe one of them had a short casting where there was a slight little hole where it was absent material, if memory serves. But obviously I was able to persevere by drilling it out and replacing it with a plastic peg, if I'm not mistaken. It's a pretty tricky procedure, but was one I was able to pull off on this build over here. As you can see, it does the job quite nicely. And this brings us directly to the track. So the tracks are the kit supplied tracks, and they are representing the rubber chevron pattern of tracks for the VVSS Sherman. And the tracks are good quality. They are actually really nicely done considering the age of the tooling, but the end connectors are in the right locations. The moldings are nice and deep. They're not shallow or anything, so they're good quality tracks. The tracks themselves, as I always mention on these videos, single piece vinyls, you never use enamel, be it from a bottle or from spray paint. Yes, spray paint is enamel paint. And the problem is that you run the risk of potentially damaging the tracks. Either they'll have a detrimental effect with the chemicals if the paints are harsh. And believe it or not, most of the expensive paints tend to be the harsher ones, but some cheap paints can do this too. You run the risk where you apply the paint to the surface and it just decays the track. It just dissolves it right in front of you. Or what can happen is that as the model ages, it can have a long-term effect on the surface, and the tracks can just brittle away and Thanos snap out of existence as well. So because of that, it's hard to determine which paints do that because the paint formulas change all the time, either from different vendors or different chemicals come on the scene and replace other chemicals. It's really a complex thing. It's chemistry. It's wild. So what I do is I throw the baby out with the bat water, and I've been doing it for at least over a decade now, and it's had some good results. I only use Tamiya acrylics on single-piece vinyl tracks. This is applied via the airbrush, just in this case, just flat black, and then I went ahead and appropriately weathered it. Now, these are rubber chevron tracks, so because of that, the rubber pad on the exterior and the interior would be rubber, so I paint them to replicate that. When you're weathering it, just a little bit of diluted flat white was airbrushed onto the surfaces to get that chalky look that we see here. And for the end connectors, these would be steel, and I went ahead and painted them with Tamiya olive drab via the paintbrush. Just a few little swipes here and there on this small scale is enough to achieve the look. Once everything is painted though and slipped in place, it gives you some very good results. As for the tension I found to be average. It's a bit, you can say, on the snug side, but it is holding together quite well. The other thing about single piece vinyl tracks, if they're like this one here, you have to make sure that the glues are thoroughly set. A lot of people out there, they always ask me what glue do I use to adhere my single piece tracks together, because this is where a lot of people hate single piece vinyls. You glue them together, or you don't glue them enough, or use the wrong type of adhesive, and then when you put them on, the tension, and they spread eagle on you, and that's not doing yourself any favors. So after the paint work was done, what I do is I use super glue to adhere my single piece vinyls together. But prior to that, I do some prep work. Prep work is with a X-Acto, I scrape off the paint on the surfaces where the two track halves have to meet. If you have paint on there, it's going to cause complications and you're going to get a weak bond. And that's where you end up with the snapping. So with the paint scratched off, I apply the glue, I set the tracks aside, and the key word is you have to let them dry. Once the glue is fully set, at that point there, you're ready for the installation onto the model. They slip on, and then, like I mentioned before, you just drop on the suspension, and you're done, and you can call it a day. Quite a bit of technique going on, but for something as simple as one would think as single piece vinyl tracks. But again, this is something that you definitely want to keep in mind when you're working on a model that has tracks similar to this. As I mentioned before, tension wasn't bad. These Sherman tracks tend to be a little bit on the tighter side. It's just the nature of the vehicle. But again, if you take your time, keyword, you have to take your time. You have to let the adhesives dry. You do that, and the build will go together much better. All right, with that out of the way, that TED Talk wrapped up, let's go ahead and jump onto the transmission. So here you can see the transmission over here. This was the same section that I mentioned before with the addition of the cast texturing, and hopefully gets into focus. You get to see it jump out at you, which is a huge improvement for something even in this small scale. I like how the fasteners are found on the flanges over there. They look fantastic with that, to me, a panel line accent added, but we'll circle back to that later. On the front portion here of the transmission housing, you get to see the blisters. Note there's no seam work on these sections here. The seams were thoroughly deleted, as I was also mentioning before. And on the tin work, you get to see the tin work straps and the cut lines added on the top portion. Moving our way up takes to the headlight cluster section. You can see what they look like with their guard enhancements added. Really does complete the look quite nicely. For the lenses, just a swipe of silver paint was all that was utilized. Just make sure that the paint is in the right location so you get the look that you see here. On the tool, you can see the shovel fitted right there. This is the kit supplied unit, carefully painted off the model and added at the tail end. And this model here, it has a mix of molded on tools as well as separate molded tools. It just depends where on the vehicle you're looking. And some people, they like to install the tools during the construction, then paint around it. I like to install them after the model's painted and weathered. Both have their advantages, both have their disadvantages. However, if you play your cards right, both will give you good or the same result. The one thing to mention is that if you are going to glue them to the model and paint around them, you have to make sure that your paintbrush game is in order. You have a really good quality paintbrush, and the paint's at the right consistency. Those two things can make or break you. And for that type of procedure, you really need to have both of those ducks in a row. But if you do, rock on. On the driver's side, you can see the addition of that handle now in its final form. Really gives the model a little bit of a nice little detail punch. Moving up, top side brings us to more Pioneer tools. And like I mentioned before, on this kit, some tools are molded on, while others are separate pieces. And here you can see what they look like in their final form. All the tools have been properly painted. When you're doing tools like this, you want to make sure you paint the straps. The straps on these vehicles here would be a webbing type material, sometimes leather, but I like to roll with the khaki material because it looks different from the remainder of the vehicle, so it gives it a little bit extra color pop, and also it looks different from the brown used on the tool handles. So it's another way to prevent things from just blending in. Here we have the cleaning staves, and note the tow cable gets secured on top of that. This is something you want to pay attention to. For the tow cables themselves, the eyelets are painted with a different shade of olive drab, so that looks different from the remainder of the vehicle. You have here this little canvas bag, painted, weathered, and fitted to the appropriate area. And on the engine area over here, you get to see the other tools. The axe and the pickaxe handle. Two of the tools are separate parts from what I remember. However, the pickaxe handle is integrally molded on. So again, you are going to have to be very careful with the paintwork in that section. Also in this area over here, you get to see the track grousers. For this, I actually didn't really paint them. I just used it to me a panel line accent. I just doubled down on the opacity here with that, and it basically goes into the area and does the hard work for me. The straps themselves, I just wiped the paint off of those two sections, and what you see here is the end result of that technique. Moving our way rearward takes to the fighting compartment. As you can see, the artillery shells have been placed in their racks. This was a little tricky to do because of the small size, but I was able to persevere with a nice precision pair of tweezers. As for the shells themselves, I painted them Tamiya olive drab, and the trickiest part was to paint the fuses as well as the barrel, or I should say the rifling bands. And that was a little tricky to do, but again, good paintbrush game was all that was required. On the bottom portion over here, I believe these are the propellant canisters, if I'm not mistaken. These would be cardboard on the real unit, so I went ahead and rendered them in that format. Of course, the seats have the padding painted with a darker shade of OD compared to the remainder of the vehicle. It just gives some more color differentiation. And all of the pulleys have been painted with a little swipe of silver in order to show that the piece does have the intersections, which paint would not last long in those areas at all. As for the pulley, or I should say the cabling itself, you can see how that was dry brushed with the weathering. It gets the nice realistic look that you have here. On the rear section, you can see the tail lights. right there, where we have the cat's eye painted red on one side, and on the other side I have it in the blackout format. Again, true to form to the real one, and you have the silver white light right below. Try to remember if they were molded in or not, or if I just added just a swipe of paint in order to get the look. But either way, if you carefully do that on these US AFV, it always really enhances it. Of course, on either side, we have a fire extinguisher painted with flat red, and then just painted the straps as well as the top handle section, which is just black. The strap is painted with the nylon color, the webbing, while the bottom base is the same color of the vehicle. Moving to the spade, you can see the weathering added to that with the panel line accent. Also painted a little tarpaulin right over here on the bottom portion, as well as the large wrench. Don't want to forget about that. Diamond plate was enhanced with the panel line accent. Something like this, panel line accent just takes to it like a duck to water, and it's always a great way to improve the look. As for the main armament, as you can see, the seam is nowhere to be found. And now it's been permanently fitted in place with the travel lock also put in the appropriate position. As I mentioned before, on this model here, you can't really make it where you can display it in the option to deploy it and have it in transport mode. You have to pick either one or the other, and like I mentioned before, I represented in the transport configuration. But if you want to go ahead and render yours in firing mode, obviously you're definitely free to do so. To do that, the travel locks need to be retracted so where it folds down over here on the front, and you need to have the plow opened up, and in order to do that, you're going to need a little bit more wire to simulate the pulleys. But other than that, what you see here is basically what you get if you build the tank, or the vehicle I should say, in this type of configuration. And that's all there is for the detailing. This takes to the paint and the weathering. So for the model's paint work, first I went ahead and thoroughly primed the model with flat black spray paint. After the flat black was added, I then went ahead and added the base coat, which is my standard US World War II shade of olive drab. The color is an exterior latex house paint. I've been utilizing this paint for many, many years, from builds from small to large, and 1/6 scale for that matter. And I absolutely love the stuff. It works great, and the end results are definitely something I'm very happy with. Some people out there, they hear me say that and they poo-poo that, or they just scoff at it, but at the end of the day, you can't complain with the quality of work that I've been bringing on the channel. So once the base coat was applied with the airbrush, it was then time to go into the weathering. For the weathering, this is a mix of both airbrush and dry brushing, as I generally say in these videos. The model does have a slight thin wash of cream applied to the surface to get that sun fade effect. Then the airbrushing was done with diluted Tamiya flat black, and that was done to do the counter shading. A lot of people, they do counter shading different than me, where the rave, all the cool kids are doing these days, is where they go ahead and they have the model either flat black, and then they take white or light gray paint and they squiggle a bunch of wacky little lines all over the thing. Kind of looks like one of those German bomber patterns, honestly. And then they add several thinned out translucent layers of the base coat to get the desired look. I always hated that technique. It's just way too convoluted in my opinion. Also, if you scratch it or need to touch it up for one reason or another, it's much more difficult to do that as opposed to having the vehicle be full opacity and then adding the washes and the counter shading after the fact. But that's just me. Anyway, so after the counter shading is done with the airbrush, I then go ahead and do the Tamiya panel line accent. For this model here, definitely one that it likes because of all the open nature of the finding compartment, the grills, and the suspension. Not to mention the diamond plate, as I was referencing before, and the spade. The panel line accent loves it. It just goes in there, does what it needs to do. And then, of course, I go over with just some dry brushing, flat black on a fan brush, and I go ahead and apply the dry brushing to the various edges to get the chipping effects that you see on a large number of my builds. After the weathering was done, the Pioneer tools were fitted in place. Of course, they were painted off the model, as I referenced before. And once that's completed, it's then time to apply the varnish. Or, I'm sorry, the decals first. So the decals here are the stock original decals. And like I was referencing before, the decals on these older ESCI kits is a bit hit and miss. This one here was a hit. Actually, it's lately been more hit than miss, so that's the good news. And the decals went on really without any sort of problems. I don't recall there being any issues of breakage or disintegrating or nothing along those lines. They simply just applied to the appropriate areas without really any sort of problems, from what I can recall. Then after the decals were added, the model was then coated with the VMS matte varnish, bringing it to the condition that you see here. The one caveat is that I never do. I don't varnish the tracks. And the reason why I don't varnish tracks is because I'm not really sure if the varnish is going to have any detrimental effects on the rubber. Now, the varnish is acrylic based, so theoretically it shouldn't have any sort of issues with that. But just to play it safe, I go ahead and varnish it, and then the tracks are added after the fact. But that's really all there is to that. What more can I say? I absolutely loved working on this one over here. In the end, this was a really fun build for me to undertake, and having it built to this condition here, specifically since this was a bagged orphan kit no less, it definitely feels really good on every level. As I mentioned earlier, these kits have been around forever. I always used to see it around in my periphery, and finally being able to snatch out of the ether and build it up, add it to the collection, it's definitely a to-do list check off for me. So, after working on this one over here, this takes us directly into skill level and recommendation. The reason why I actually took on this video, as I mentioned before, was one of my subscribers out there would always clamor high and low on how hard or challenging or difficult is this kit. Well, now that the dust is settled, I've built it. My final thoughts on it for recommendations, or I should say for skill level, is, well, if you're a beginner, no, this is not a kit for a beginner. If you are an intermediate builder or an advanced builder, yes, this is firmly in that threshold of a intermediate to advanced builder. The reason why a beginner cannot tackle one of these builds is quite simply put, it's just too fiddly and it's a bit overly complex for a beginner. Namely, with the spade section in the rear, how it's a multi-piece assembly, and there's no real defined way it goes together. This is something that if you're not on your A game with, you're going to have a problem with, and I could see that throwing a loop for some other individuals out there. Also, the suspension. It's very small, it's very fiddly, and with these small surfaces they can easily break, this too can give a beginner a really hard time and will definitely probably give a sour taste in their mouth. Outside of that, the other features that are found on this kit are also very small. So because of that fiddly nature, a beginner is definitely not someone who I can recommend this kit to. This again, I could recommend this kit for someone that's done at least a dozen or so kits. And at that point there, you should have your fundamentals in a row for dealing with sprue removal, fine part removal, things like that. And once you're at that level there, then a kit like this becomes more viable in my opinion. So does this one live up to the hype of being an extremely challenging, very frustrating build? In my experience, no. I've built way more challenging kits than this one over here. This one was more or less pretty much a breeze. With the exception of the rear section with the fitting on those areas, other than that, the rest of the build pretty much goes together quite well. Even the multi-hull layout of the hull where the bottom plate and the side sections need to be assembled, that too is something that went together pretty well. There are a lot of other harder kits out there. One that comes to mind would be the Mini Art the SU 122/54 kit. That was a challenging one that really I had to pace myself on. Another one would have been the Dragon Akhrad armor car with the Pack 40 in the superstructure. That too was one that, okay, you need to pump your brakes with and really take your time with. Also, another one that just came to mind was the Dragon Smart Kit of the Czech 38T, the one with the fuel trailer. That too was another one that, yeah, you can't just rush into. You have to basically take your time with in order to put it together. Those were more challenging. This one here, it's definitely not the easiest, but it's definitely nowhere close to being the hardest. This is actually more or less a traditional kit, with the exception of, again, some of the fiddly nature of some of the parts. If you could get around that, this build here becomes a pussycat. There are quite a few aftermarket parts out there for this example over here. Obviously, I went ahead and designed the manifold systems that were mentioned in this video, but there's even an aftermarket conversion set for this kit, if I'm not mistaken, that transforms it from the M12 into the ammunition carrier, which is basically the M12 just sans the armament. It's just a weapons carrier that carries all the ammo and the propellant that travels with these things to keep them equipped. That's a pretty cool conversion out there. There's also another M12 on the market in 1/72nd scale that I forgot to mention before, where that one is from a Eastern European company. I think it's UM, if I'm not mistaken. I'll throw a picture of the box art on screen now. So if you're looking for a 1/72nd scale M12, basically these are the only two kits available. Yes, there's the Hasegawa, but again, the Hasegawa is this example here. The other critique that I was told was that because it's an ESCI kit, the glues don't bond to it. And that has not been my experience. I've built lots of ESCI kits. I use super glue on all of my models, and super glue just works perfectly with these ones here. But also in the past, I've built a few ESCIs where I use the dreaded red tube model glue, and although that crap is awful on every level, don't ever use it. I was younger at the time. Excuse me. But even though I've built ESCIs with the red tube, and the testers seem to work just fine, or as good as red tube can possibly work. So as for the material being an issue with assembly, frankly, I'm not seeing that. It's just interesting that that was a concern, and that's never something I've seen. I've built several ESCIs in different scales, but that is one thing I did want to clear up and mention. So if you're building one of these, definitely use super glue. It works just fine. It also lasts a lot longer too than red tube. That's just a rule of thumb, though. Nothing much more needs to be said about that, which drives us directly into recommendations. So straight from the gate, if you're a fan of US artillery pieces or SPGs, this model here becomes highly recommended. If you're a fan of the Sherman, you're a diehard Shermanaholic, this model here is also one I cannot recommend enough. The M12 is definitely in the Sherman family, although it's technically an M3 Lee. Either way, it's definitely covered under the umbrella of the Sherman family. And this one here builds very nice. It's a really interesting piece, and it's one that will greatly improve and enhance that collection immensely. Obviously, if you're into collecting vehicles like the M40 and you already have one in your collection, the M12 here should also be on your hit list. This was the precursor to the M40, so it's nice to have both of them represented again in the collection. Like with many of the other ESCI kits out there, this one here is highly collectible, and it's one that is also readily easily found. These models here are low-hanging fruit because they made such a large number of them throughout the years, and they are still in production today in one way, shape, or form or another. Last time I checked, I believe Italeri does have the molds for these and have re-released them periodically, and the last re-release was one that happened fairly recently. Because of that, tracking one of these down, very easy and also affordable when found. By extension, if you're into wargaming, these models are very popular and are awesome for wargaming because, again, of their availability. The model, though, is a bit on the frail side for wargaming. If you're going to use it for that purpose, you're probably going to render it in the deployed state, or you can have both, like I did with this one here with the transport mode. But if you are going to have it in deployed state, I recommend having one of those placards where you have like a little mini diorama with it, so it's easier to move around on the game table without potentially causing damage to the piece. This one here, it's a bit on the frailer end because of the spade section, but if you can work around that, yeah, this actually becomes a viable piece to add to your wargaming collection. Back to what I was saying before, these ESCI kits are quite popular, they're quite collectible, and with this one being as affordable and common as it is, it's one that can be found without breaking the bank. And it's actually, again, a really cool piece, and it's one that when you have it in your collection, it feels really good to, again, scratch that one off of the hit list. It's going to look even better when it's paired up with my 1/35th scale Academy counterpart, but that's a topic for another video for another day. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for my 1/72nd scale US M12 SPG. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this one over here, or my larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook, where I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as photographs of the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been seen on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again. I'll be seeing you all again on the next one. See you there.